Welcome back to the Running Wine Mom podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Cieslinski, aka the Running Wine Mom. Today, we're exploring the intersections of leadership, spirituality, and crisis with a truly remarkable guest, Meredith Wilson Parfet. Meredith is not only the CEO and founder of the Raveyard Group, a consultancy specializing in crisis management. She is also a hospice chaplain, death doula, and Reiki master. With an MBA and a background in high-level corporate leadership, Meredith brings a unique mix of strategic insight and compassionate care to her work. In her role, she helps leaders navigate some of the most intense challenges, personal, professional, and emotional. Together, we'll be unpacking her views on suffering, resilience, and the human-centered approach that she believes is essential for managing crisis effectively. From the boardroom to the bedside, Meredith challenges us to rethink how we approach life's most difficult moments. So without further ado, let's welcome Meredith. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited for our conversation today. And just as we were kind of talking about connecting with women who are just doing amazing things, and you are certainly one of them. And before we get into that, to start each episode, we have our wine, and win of the week segment. This is where we share our favorite bottle of wine, vent about something that's been bothering us, and celebrate our recent victory. So grab a glass, take a deep breath, and let's get started. So Meredith, what is your wine WINE of the week?
I am pretty strictly a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc person.
Yes.
So I love Cloudy Bay. I could go for a Kim Crawford at any time. So pretty much that kind of
Yes.
sour, acidic Sauvi is my go-to.
And fun fact, my cousin lives in New Zealand. He moved to New Zealand, I think it's 12 years ago, and he makes wine. So that's one of, yeah. Yes, Decibel Wine. He has a great Sauvignon Blanc too, and a lot of others. But yeah, it's like I always liked Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, but then he ended up moving there, and now he makes it there.
Have you been to visit yet?
Yes, once. I guess it's like 13 years ago. It was beautiful there. Have you ever been?
I have. Yeah, I went for the first time this year and it was just mind-blowing. It's incredible.
Did you go to the North Island or the South Island?
South Island, we were
Okay.
mainly in Queenstown and just
Yes,
loved
so
it.
beautiful. That I think about the water there like probably once a week.
It
It's
was
just like
incredible.
breathtaking.
It was.
So what is your WHINE of the week?
One of the things I think about in crisis a lot is how people react to stress with outrage. And I would say sometimes outrage is a justified thing, but this week it feels like everyone in our country is outraged about everything. And I don't think outrage is useful. I think it's normal, but I don't think it has utility. And so,
Mhm.
yes, my wine would be listening to everyone's outrage this week versus thinking productively about what should we be doing or how do we connect or asking curious questions instead of just banging the table about things.
Yes, I have had to like step a little bit away from social media because it's been very overwhelming this week. And this episode will probably be out later than what it is. But for those listening, we're coming kind of right off of the election week and there's lots of big feelings. And you're right. People, it's very easy to share a post or write something that you're so angry about something. But hey, well, what can you do next? Let's solve the problem instead of just sitting upset about it.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, what is your win of the week?
I'm excited to be here. I haven't, as you know, I just came off of a TED Talk and I haven't done a lot of podcasts, and this is fun. And I'm happy to be talking to you and especially connecting with other moms and talking about my work in a context that I don't usually talk about it.
Yeah, and when I saw you posting about the TED Talk and I knew you were coming up on the podcast, I was so excited for you. And then I felt like so cool, like, oh my gosh, she's coming on and she's doing a TED Talk. Like she's huge. Not that I didn't think that I already thought highly of you, but what a cool experience, which I'm going to ask about later.
And so I'm happy to be here. This is
Yay!
it's been big changes for me and a lot of new experiences. So
I
I'm happy.
love that. So I always like to ask my guests, what is one significant challenge you've successfully navigated shaping your journey to where you are today?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a loaded question for someone who works in crisis and in hospice. People often say, well, how did you get into hospice? And like most of us show up there because of a lot of losses. So
Mhm.
I have navigated personal loss, the death of my sister nearly 20 years ago, a lot of other losses, my own near death, major professional catastrophes. So part of why I do the work I do is because I've stood in various forms of hardship and had to figure out what ways do you get through it? How do you
Hmm.
actually cope? What's a pragmatic kind of solution? So I think my whole life just probably defined trying to
Yeah.
navigate hard things.
But that links back to your wine of your WHINE of the week. Like, you did something about the problems that you continue to face. You could have sat back and just said, "Oh my gosh, this is my life and this is horrible," but changing it into something that is helping so many people. Like, what a great gift that you're giving the world. So that's
Yeah.
wonderful.
It's trial
And
and error. I mean, when you say outrage, e I felt that outrage. Everything I've done, everything I
mhm,
write about, all of my work in crisis is typically something that first I lived it and went, "Wow, I'm super outraged. Is this serving me?" And you do
mhm.
things ineffectively enough times, and you're like, "I gotta do it a different way."
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And again, we will talk more about that in a bit. But first, we're going to talk about fitness, the running wine mom. What is your favorite way to stay active?
So I'm lucky I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is a
Oh, wow.
pretty active place. It is not unusual if someone calls you for a work meeting to say, "Should we meet on the trail? Should
I
we
love
hike?"
that.
We have hiking meetings here, which I think is kind of an amazing way of staying fit and getting things done. So, my nearest trail is like 4 or 5 blocks away. I spend a lot of time outside, um, and I'm obsessed with pickleball. Like
Well, I just started teaching pickleball I just got done a unit of pickleball for teaching my high school students. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never really played it, but it's huge in our area
Yeah,
and courts are coming up everywhere. And it's a great lifelong activity.
I'm obsessed with it, so
Love it. I'm always like, okay, what's this part? The kitchen. They're like, why are the words so weird?
and the rules are complicated, but once you
Yeah.
it's really fun.
Yeah. And how does maintaining your fitness contribute to your understanding of the relationship between mental health and physical fitness?
It was part of that learning around surviving hardship for me is that if I'm not managing my cortisol, if I'm not getting enough vitamin D, if I'm not finding a pressure release that is productive and useful and serves my body instead of is hard on my body, then you can't get through crisis. And so
Hmm.
those that is intertwined. I think hard things require exercise as one of the easiest things we can do to get through them.
Yes, great advice. So let's get into a little parenthood. Tell us about your family.
I am married, have been with my husband for 17 years. We have 2 boys, 13 and 9, and we also live near my parents. So I'm the only living child of my parents, so I get the high beams of all of their attention and help, which is great.
Yeah, that's nice. I always say would not be surviving without our parents.
Mhm.
What do you think you were least prepared for in parenthood?
I don't think I recognized how much of my own stuff being a parent would stir up, that I'm a perfectionist, and it pushes straight into that, and
Hmm.
I was laughing with somebody the other day saying that I have what I think is probably an anxious attachment style, and so I'll be with my kids, "Are you mad at me? Do you hate me? Am I your worst parent ever?" Like, any piece of me that needs a little bit of polishing or work, my children bring out. So part of the parenting is the inner piece of it that is
Yeah.
it's a
That
lot.
was not something there. I really think like somebody needs to make a book on that about preparing for parenthood because like you read all these books about how to sleep train and how to feed your baby and how to do this. And it's like, well, the biggest thing is, well, why are these things triggering me when like it's a baby that they don't know, they're not purposely doing anything, but it's your own self,
Totally.
which has been really hard to navigate. So I totally relate to that. What's one piece of advice that you would give to other parents?
One of the things I talk about around grief is the idea that most of our inner world is invisible. And parenting, a lot of that inner world is also invisible. And so, advice is be kind and gentle to yourself, be curious, but also be kind and gentle to other parents. I feel like
Yeah,
it's easy to stand in judgment of, I'm on the breastfeeding side, I'm on the non breast, whatever the polarity is. And then we judge each other. And most of us who stand in the trenches of being parents, moms, it's hard
it's
and
hard.
deserves a lot more kindness than I think we show each other.
I can totally, yes, that is great advice. And as I always say, what works for you does not work for me, does not work for the other person. So, like, just everybody stay in their own lane, but let's all ride together, you know?
Great. That's great advice.
So let's get into you now. Your career path is really unique. CEO, crisis consultant, hospice chaplain, death doula. Can you share a little bit more in depth about what inspired you to kind of pursue such a wide range of roles?
Sure. So I came out of college and worked in finance, went to business school, thought I was going to work in finance. And a couple months into it, my younger sister died of an overdose. It was accidental, related to a spinal injury, but it was catastrophic for my family. And so as I was trying to compete in a challenging, what would be kind of quasi work environment, I was suffering from just crippling grief. I did not know how to survive. Fast forward, I had a lot of other losses right around then. And then actually when I was in childbirth, a doctor cut one of my arteries. My son was breech.
Okay.
And so snipped an artery, didn't realize it, sewed me back up. And so I bled out for almost 8 hours. So I had my own near death experience and then just got obsessed with death and dying as this, why does this keep happening to me? Why, like, what does this mean? And I thought that was how everybody responded to when everybody started getting obsessed with death. Turns out that most people don't, but I started reading everything I could. I started attending death and dying seminars, and ultimately I landed in hospice as a volunteer, and I really loved it. It just continued to speak to me spiritually as a part of my own grief journey, all things. So then I was like, well, maybe if I keep going, I can get more into this. So I became a death doula. And I was like, what else could I do? So I went back and got a 2-year master's in spiritual care so that I could be a hospice chaplain, which basically gives me permission. I'm on staff at my local hospice a couple shifts a month and can walk in any room, see any patient, talk to any family about grief, death, dying, trauma. So I was on that path and then also working still in finance when I was inside of an investment fund that blew up. We invested in a fraud. It wasn't our fraud. We didn't know about it, but it triggered all kinds of fallout, terrible investor losses. The bad guys went to jail for like 20 years. So then I experienced professional grief and
Yeah.
wow, this grief feels like this grief feels like this grief. And so ultimately created a consulting firm that we do crisis management for big organizations like fraud, scandal, accidents, fatalities, things like
Yeah, and it's so needed. And as I was reading about you, I just thought it was so interesting because I guess I didn't realize something like that kind of existed. Like I knew you would go to someone in that situation, but I didn't know exactly what you would do. And you would be the firm that would be doing that.
that's right.
And then so also you just did a TED Talk. So can you tell me about what is the process with that? How did you get involved with that? What did you talk about? Give us all the details.
It just unfolded in some ways. I love my work because it emerged out of my own experiences, my own learnings, a lot of failure. And so I started writing years ago and I started kind of speaking on it. And about 8 months ago, I was introduced to someone at TED, and just to meet them, someone then said, send them a pitch." I was like, "Okay."
Yeah.
So you have to write a proposal and apply. They get tens of thousands of applications, but it felt, I think, like a time where there's a lot of collective crisis, collective grief, whether that's political polarization or healthcare system, climate change, and then there's a lot of individual grief, a lot of us
Mhm.
carrying around things that are hard. So I pitched that to TED and then got absorbed into their process. It was incredible. They have curators and speaking coaches and content experts. It's a whole next level of public speaking. So did 4 or 5 months of prep for what was ultimately about 1,100 words and 8 minutes long.
That is it's so interesting how much you like put into it. And then, I mean, a memorable 8 minutes, but it's like really a lot of work for
It was.
that amount of time. Well, that's
It was
amazing.
interesting, though, because it really forced me to refine what I was trying to say and do it in the most clear, most succinct way. So,
Hmm.
actually, that piece was a very useful exercise.
Yeah.
And I think about everything in life as a spiritual endeavor. So it put me to the test of
Yeah.
how do I wrestle with myself and this fear, anxiety, nerve,
Yeah.
all kinds of things.
So, how did you feel when you were talking? Did you feel really overly anxious, or how you felt when you were done? Did you feel relief?
I mean, I pulled out every spiritual, mindful, emotional, psychological tool that I'd ever learned over 47 years of living. Uh, and spent like I did a 3-day silent meditation retreat before I went, and I worked with a number of different coaches on mindset, on ways of practicing. So if you'd asked me the week before, I was a puddle. But once I got there, I was able to center myself pretty well, and I just kept saying, "This needs to be fun. This
Hmm.
needs to be something that's cool and enlivening and exciting versus just awful." And
Right.
just kept telling myself that, and it ended up actually being really, really fun.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Well, congrats. So, let's talk a little bit about crisis management with the human centered approach. So, in your experience, how can organizations maybe integrate human centered care into their crisis management approaches, and why is it so essential?
So, just the idea of human-centered belies the question, why aren't we centering it around humans? Why aren't we centering all of work around
Hmm.
humans? We're the ones who show up. We put in all the effort. And yet what you see, especially I think from the American workforce, but I think from the global workforce, is that a lot of people hate their jobs. They feel dehumanized. What's the opposite of dehumanized is humanized. That
Hmm.
we would say people have emotions. They have entire lives outside of work. They have things that they're sad about, things that they're happy about. And when we put them at the center, especially in a crisis, we solve all of those pieces of them. So,
Hmm.
for instance, what gets omitted in crisis management is the idea that we grieve. When we experience crisis, we are flooded with cortisol, flooded with adrenaline. That's a biological response that is outside of our control. So you get flooded with those things. Whether it's a personal crisis or a professional crisis, you still go into work
Hmm.
with those things. So in hospice, what we call prolonged kind of exposure to cortisol and adrenaline is grief brain. So if you have the death of a loved one and you go back to work, you bring that grief brain with you. If you're the CEO of a company and you've had something catastrophic happen, the grief brain is there too, and you bring that into the work. So if we don't address people's inner world, you can't actually solve any of the tangible pieces of the crisis.
Yeah. So, how does addressing these emotional and irrational responses, like, how does it improve a team's ability to handle the crisis more effectively? What are kind of the steps that you would give for people to get to that level?
So I think about it as two things. You have crisis that happens,
Hmm.
and you have then an inner world and an outer world. The inner world is where we grieve. For grievers, you have to give emotional awareness. I always tell people that that's the time to think about your bad habits. What are your patterns when things get hard? All of that comes out. So we need tools and skills and framework to address the grief. But we also, in crisis in the outer world, experience chaos. Often in crisis management, what you'll see is people will call their lawyers or they'll call their PR firm. Neither of those are perfectly set up to address chaos. Chaos needs order.
Right.
So we need ways of creating order that are checklists and timelines and decision trees and message maps and just a lot of structure. It's like being a parent. When your child is absolutely bonking out, usually they need comfort
Hmm.
and they need structure. It's kind of the same thing in crisis.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was going to ask next, like what steps you take to foster really a mindset that values people's needs alongside organizational strategies when managing a crisis. Because I know when you're in a crisis, it's hard to get into those. So you kind of just step in and guide people to do that, or what kind of steps do you take for that?
So at the highest level, I like to think about us as grievers or just genre as people who experience hard things as being one of two types. We are either barriers, so we take negative emotions and pain and we just
Hmm.
pretend it's not there. Barriers tend to be robotic, they tend to be kind of mechanical. Often you'll hear barriers say things like, just stay positive, or you're just so tough, or I'm compartmentalizing. So barriers. Detonators, which is me, tend to just barf their feelings out. Like,
Okay.
I have to get it out. I'm volatile. I get really excessive. I'm like, I call my business partner and I go, oh my gosh, I have to tell you what's happened. So detonators and barriers.
I'm a barrier for sure.
Sometimes we do both, but most of us have like a go-to type. If you understand your type and you can kind of think about the types of the people in the room around you, like if you're around a conference, then if you're a barrier, you're a barrier. If I come to you with all of my emotional volatility, you're going to be like, back away. If you're a barrier and you come to me, no empathy, totally robotic, let's get this done. I'll be like, you don't care about me.
Hmm.
So, just that understanding of the conflict of how we handle negative emotions gives us some framework for being like, oh, she doesn't want all my emotions right now. I should call someone like
Who
my foot.
does? Right.
I should put that somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the part for the grief. And then for the chaos, I have four simple questions. What is the crisis? What are my trade-offs? What is my priority? And what do I do next?
Hmm.
And there's a whole kind of set of thinking around what those questions mean, but define what it is you're solving for. Don't be in denial. Understand in crisis, you only have hard choices. This hard choice or this hard choice. Which one are you going to make? And
Hmm.
then pick your priority and go in that direction. And when you're like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to do," just micro bites of a solution one step at a time.
Well, that's great advice. Yeah, and I'm like now thinking about the that me being a barrier. And it's like my sister is the opposite of me, and it's so funny because I'll be like, "Oh my god, my coworker just came and it's like crying," and I'm just like,
Get
"Are
all the
you okay?" And my sister's like cracking up laughing at me like, "Oh my god, you're terrible." I'm like, "No, I don't know how to deal with it properly." I guess, but
But you have to assume that those are also superpowers for
yeah.
us. So
Yeah.
all the barriers I know tend to be very analytical, very
Mhm.
steady in a crisis, measured in their response. Whereas the detonators I know tend to be innovators. They tend to move ideas forward. They tend
Mhm.
to be willing to take risks about things. So
Yeah.
there's a light and a shadow. You need both.
Yeah, I love that. You've also spoken about wrestling with spiritual and temporal questions. So, suffering, materialism, death. How do these elements kind of show up in the professional world, and why should leaders take them seriously?
I mean, I'm probably a microcosm of them because we are on Instagram together.
Yes.
So my handle is chaplain MBA because part of me wants to give this kind of wise, grounded response to things. And the other part of me has a closet full of shoes and handbags that she loves so much.
Mhm.
I wrestle with, what does it mean to be virtuous? What does it mean to show up in a way that's humble and of service? And what happens if I really, really want a handbag or 27,000 pairs of shoes? So I think I have both pieces to my brain. And I think work kind of asks us the same questions, right? Of what are we here for? What are we here to connect with and support people? I think so.
Mhm.
But we're also usually there to get a job done and to be in the world and play inside a system that tends to be about money and facts and nuts and bolts of doing things. And so can we hold both of those things together? Can we try and bring the best of both into any setting that we're in, really?
Yeah. And that is really important to do, to find, I feel like, happiness in the workplace.
Yeah.
So, what do you think are common mistakes that you see companies make when they deal with crisis? What advice would you kind of give them to avoid these pitfalls?
Two things happen. One is they jump to problem solving before they ask that first question of what is the crisis. And I think we do this in our personal lives too,
Hmm.
is we jump to solutions. We want to have an answer. We want to have it all figured out, but we don't take a step back and define it. So step one, what is the crisis? And if you go around a room and you ask people, everyone gives a different answer. So
So
build
true.
alignment, understand where the conflict is, then decide how you're going to move forward. Another thing is people tend to call their lawyers, which gives them legal solutions, but not always practical business solutions. Or they call a PR firm, and immediately the PR firm says, I'm going to write a statement. We're going to have to
Hmm.
issue that thing. Step back. What is the crisis? What are we trading off here? What's our priority? Maybe you don't need a PR firm right now. Maybe there's
Yeah.
something we can do to handle the press. So, thinking systematically about a response versus just jumping into it, that is the biggest pitfall.
Yeah, I feel like that it's only natural for, these CEOs who are natural problem solvers of huge
Totally.
problems to be like, we can fix this. But yeah, it's so true that they need to look at everything else.
But we do this in our
Yeah.
personal lives too.
Yeah, for sure.
We jump to, like, fixing things for other people without really
Yeah.
understanding what it is that we're solving for.
So let's kind of jump a little bit to the hospice and death doula work that you do. For listeners who maybe are unfamiliar with the role of a death doula, could you share how you support people through the end of life process and what the work really means to you personally?
Sure. We are, especially in Western society, the US, Europe, pretty death denying. We pretend it's not gonna happen. We avoid it. We don't talk about it. And, most of us believe that we're going to die at 99 with our arms over our chest and just close our eyes. That is not how the majority of humans die. It's messy, it's complicated, it brings up really painful emotions. Any conflict you've ever had in your family intensifies when
Yeah.
someone's dying or in grief. So doulas are like birth doulas. Death doulas are like birth doulas. They are there to companion the dying and support them through this pivotal kind of time of change in the way that people have birth doulas at their bedside when they're delivering a baby. They recognize these are the moments of change in our life. It's a shorter training. For me, it was 8 weeks of really understanding the death and dying process that then I took even further once I became a chaplain, which take
Yeah.
what little I knew about death and dying from that and then supercharged it for how do you help people through these things.
And yeah, and I didn't know that there were death doulas until I read the book, The Collected Regrets of Clover. I actually interviewed the author of that, Mickey Brammer, because I was so interested with it. And then I interviewed another a death doula in the winter and just learned a lot about it. And it's so interesting. And I didn't even know there was a step above that for the hospice chaplain. So I'm learning more and more. But, like, how much more what is the difference of, like, the depthness of, I mean, I know it's 2 more years that you learn, but how kind of is it different than just being, in the 8-week program?
I mean, to become a chaplain, it's people do it in different ways. Some people
Mhm.
do it by getting a master's in divinity. Historically, people think about it as a religious role, but my job, I'm a humanist, first of all, and second of all, my job is to show up for whomever is in the room with whether they have a faith, a religious tradition, no religious tradition. My job is just to be with them. So a lot of it is about addressing existential questions, addressing questions of fear. Chaplains work in secular settings. So there are military chaplains, there are prison chaplains. A friend of mine does death row chaplaincy. You can do it in schools. Like it's usually in secular settings that face crisis or trauma or death in
Okay.
those ways. I've always been called to work in hospice because it's the death and dying piece that's most interesting to me.
Yeah, and so many people, they just associate hospice work with emotional heaviness, but how do you manage to bring a sense of balance and hope to such challenging situations? To not only yourself, I mean yourself too. I'm sure it's emotionally heavy, but to the families as well.
It's dual. It is, some days are very, very emotionally
Mhm.
heavy. I always tell people that in hospice, all of the things we haven't fixed as a society show up to die in hospice. So, not fixing our healthcare system or our immigration system in whatever way that means, not
Mhm.
fixing issues of homelessness, not fixing issues of poverty, all of that, those people die just like everyone else does. And often it's on hospice to sort through, how do you help people who are unhoused die a good death? Or how do you help people in poverty have the means and the understanding and the tools and resources to support a loved one who's dying? So that heaviness for me, I carry around a lot. Individually working with families, there are two pieces. One, it's not my grief, so it's not mine to take home.
Mhm.
And the work is an honor. It is such a sacred, incredible, powerful experience that for me, it's enlivening more than it's draining.
Mhm.
It is the singular most important type of work I've ever done for making me live a good life. So I love it. I get so much out of it.
Yeah, I can only imagine how. And again, you think of your own family, when you're thinking of death, it's not always necessarily about other people, but I have since it's been about a year I think since I finished the book about the death doula, and it's been such like on my mind about all those things. People who don't have anyone,
Mhm.
what, do they do, and just having you there is so wonderful. I love that.
It's incredible work, and it just it so enriches my life.
Yeah, they need more people like that in the
Mm.
world for sure. So let's kind of hop a little bit back towards the crisis management with some tools and techniques. You emphasize operationalizing crisis response with specific tools and frameworks. So what are some of the most effective tools that you use to kind of help organizations manage crisis?
So, assume that you're in grief brain, right?
Yeah.
First, professional doesn't matter. You're in grief brain, so you need order. You need simple order, right? That adding a lot of complexity to a brain that's already tired isn't very effective.
Mhm.
So, it's actually deceptively simple to go back and use frameworks like map out the timeline.
Mhm.
Tell me what happens now and what happens in 6 months, and draw it. Sometimes I'll roll out a butcher block paper and go, "All right, today you've gotta call the lawyers. 6 months from now, you have to work through the insurance." Just draw it out, because then people can begin to take some of that out of the mental load, and then you say, "Okay, let's draw a decision tree. If I do this, this happens. If I do this, this happens. What happens if this happens?" Just making things very concrete and very simple and putting them on paper. It's an amazingly effective way for managing any type of crisis. When I'm with hospice patients, you'll see how overwhelmed the families get having to do so many, negotiate with insurance, solve for all the prescriptions, whatever it is. I do the same thing.
Mhm.
Let's make a checklist. Okay, now let's map it out in order. What do you need to do next? Okay, just do that. What do you need to do tomorrow? Just do
Right.
that. Right. So it's just make it tangible and concrete in the same way we do with our children.
Right.
Right.
That's it all kind of it's all connected in every way. And I was even thinking like today I'm mapping out my next marking period class. I do driver's ed, and I'm like stressing out, putting everything together in a Google sheet. I'm like, "Oh, I finally put it in a sheet." And my like coworker's like, "Well, don't you just have everything in your Google Drive?" I'm like, "Yeah, but like then I have to search for it and it's not in any specific order." And as you're saying this, it totally aligned with like the way I was feeling. It just made me feel so much better. It's like everything in the direct order that I need to do it. Just so you don't have to think about where's this and that and
The,
miss the
the fourth
checklist.
question that I said of what to do next, there's
Yeah.
a Buddhist phrase called the next right thing that's based on the Noble Eightfold Path. But basically, what is the next right thing?
Hmm.
Is this kind of micro habiting of, don't think about what you have to do 6 months from now. Just
Yeah.
write it down, put it on your list, and just do what comes next, because we get paralyzed with this fear of, I can't get it all done. I don't know where to start. Like, great. Allot 15 minutes and do 15 minutes of the next right thing.
Yeah, that's so it's and so with all of that you've talked about between, with the crisis management and putting things in order, what advice would you give to leaders or maybe someone wanting to develop their own crisis management skills, like especially those who might not be working in the field directly? So in any, I, for example, I don't know if it would apply to like our principle of teaching because I know the business world is so different than the teaching world, but I'm just thinking so many of these skills can be just I know they can be brought in everywhere, but what advice would you give to leaders?
Totally, but that's exactly it. If you wanna put humans at the center of any of this, you're human, I'm human.
Mhm.
We mostly have the same responses to things. Business is not different than other settings. We just arbitrarily make it different. But I use these tools in my personal life. Like my 13-year-old was freaking out about his algebra homework. I'm never going to learn this. I have too many things to do. I have to do my art homework. And I said, great. How about we do 15 minutes of you listen to YouTubes about this algebra concept that you don't understand and then stop. You don't have to do any more than that, right? What's the next right thing? Take a micro bite of it and then stop. We can all use that.
Mhm. For
Or,
sure.
you know, you're at school and you see someone having a hard experience and you're watching them kind of bury it. Hey, seems like that's super hard. I'm here for you if you wanna talk about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, be
Yeah.
human everywhere. It's amazing how well that
Yeah.
works.
It's, crazy that again, you're bringing it back to being so simple. Just
But,
be human and
work is not different. Like,
I know.
those people are also going to die. People in
Yeah.
every setting are all like, let's reduce this down to the key thing of we are human everywhere. We all have
Just
patterns. If we just could show up with a little more humanity in all these different settings, we would manage things just generally better.
yeah, I totally agree. Well, you deal so much with other people's emotion. How do you take care of yourself and what, keeps you motivated to not get stuck in the negativity of what you could be surrounded by, I guess?
It's funny, I listened to somebody talk about the stigma of getting mental health care, and I'm like, "No way. If I could find a person,
Yeah.
I want you for
Yep.
this." I'm like, I would if I could have a person for everything, I would do that. I have a
Yeah.
pickleball coach, I have a therapist, I have a spiritual advisor. I'm like, get as much support as you're able to. Find community everywhere that you can. Have people that you can have true hard conversations with about what you're going through. Connect, and be curious. And so that has become this my kind of path through all of these heavy emotions is I try and seek connection everywhere I can.
Mhm. It's so important.
I get help. I've had therapists for decades. I love it. I'm like,
Mhm.
I think a full list of all the things. Goody, okay. And that it comes from a place of curiosity instead of a place of feeling like I'm broken.
Right.
I went through so many hard things. And there were points in that when I thought, I'm broken. I'm wrecked forever. And eventually it became this shift of like, it's so interesting to be human. What does this mean?
Mhm.
How do I solve this? And if I don't know how to solve it, where is there wisdom out there that I can find? So, and I get tons of exercise, lots of sunshine, all of which comes from a place of privilege, right? I'm lucky that I can hire resources to help me. I'm lucky that I live in a sunny, beautiful place near the mountains, but music, art, exercise, community, curiosity, and getting the mental health care you need.
Love that. That was great. I think that's the perfect ending, unless there's anything you think that we missed, but I think
Oh,
you really hit on everything and that is a beautiful way. I love that that ending to kind of just what yeah, because people are afraid that if they ask questions that they're looked at as like wrong or if they seek help it's looked at as wrong. Again, totally agree with everything. I'm about the curiosity
yeah.
as well. Like, we're only here for who knows how long. Why not just get all, I love it, get all the help and all the love and all everything that you need. So that's great.
But I'm even watching you as you are engaging in this conversation and talking about your podcast as a part of your practice. right? As a
Yeah.
part of you saying, I'm a curious human who wants to grow and wants to seek resources and get help in how to be human. Like,
Yeah.
what an incredible service you're doing, but also what an interesting inquiry.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I really have found, again, I didn't know that any of this would be brought to me when I started this podcast, but it's all people that I'm interested in. And like, I would love to just like, if I met you out and we were having a glass of wine, a glass of
Right.
New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc,
That means
you know, and having the same conversation. It's like, but I never would have met you or had this conversation had I not, reached out and had this podcast. Like I've learned so much from my guests. It's so invaluable. And it's all because of curiosity of like, I want to
curiosity.
know what does a death doula do? Tell me more about crisis management.
Right, right, right. No,
um,
thank you. Thanks for this conversation. It was really, really fun.
yes, it was so fun.
And
All
now
right.
and friends on Instagram. So
Yeah, yes. So when I come to Boulder, Colorado,
you're welcome
we're
to
going
it.
to hike.
I would love it. Bring it on. Come visit.
Yes. All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this incredible episode of The Running Wine Mom. I want to extend a huge thank you to Meredith for joining us and sharing her profound insights. You've truly shown us the power of blending empathy and strategy, whether we're facing personal challenges or managing crisis in our professional lives. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it. You can follow me on Instagram at @therunningwinemom_. And Meredith, where can the listeners find you?
I am a chaplain MBA on Instagram, I think on Facebook too. And my website is meredithparfet.com.
Perfect. And I will link all of that. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you. This was really, really fun. It was great. Thanks.
Yes. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember, you are strong, you are capable, and you are all amazing. Until next time, keep running, keep sipping, and keep embracing the joy of motherhood. Cheers. And I will be back next Tuesday.